Okay, let's go ahead and move on to the next section. We're going to be looking at 20th century American art. And so, very similar to Mexican art that we just talked about, we're going to start with a social realist movement. And so, the Harlem Renaissance was from the 1920s and 30s, and this was a art style that had originated in Harlem section of New York City that was portraying scenes of the working class, racism, and other forms of social injustice. Many of the artists of this time period had their families had immigrated from the South to the North to find work. And the Harlem Renaissance was really encouraged by the new Negro movement. So the writer Alan Locke encouraged artists to work in an African style to represent their cultural heritage. And so this was a style that wasn't necessarily just about art, it also was for music, theater, and literature. So this is a painting by Aaron Douglas that was painted for a library. And so if you look really closely at it, you'll see that he's represented a lot of imagery based on Black history. So if we start from the left to the right, you'll notice that he has imagery of the Ku Klux Klan. He has slaves picking cotton. In the back of that, he has Black soldiers of the Civil War. He has in the center a preacher or a speaker, very similar to like a Roman orator. We have freed slaves on the right side, and we have um, also some African architecture, very similar to the mosque in Mali that we studied. So you can see how he reminds people that a lot of history is African history. So remembering that Egypt is in Africa. So the artist that we have in our 250 is Jacob Lawrence, and the Whitney houses half of the collection of his work. And so there's a great article that you can go to that's linked on Canvas in the section for this unit that has this link, like I said. And you'll notice that it has a lot about his upbringing. So Lawrence's family immigrated from the South, and he um, finally settles into some of the major cities in the North. So he lived in New York and New Jersey for a time. He lived in Philadelphia. A lot of his imagery is based on Black history, but also on his personal experience. And so he would often paint imagery of historical figures, images of history like the slave trade, migration, and pre civil rights movement conditions. So remember that he's living in a time before Martin Luther King and before the civil rights movement. So you can see here that he would do a series of paintings, I should say, and there would be a number of paintings that would tell stories. So this one is, of course, in French, so I can't pronounce it for you. But here we have a slave who's being liberated in Haiti. He has a Harriet Tubman series. And then this has our piece in the 250, which is called The Migration of the Negro. We're looking at panel 49. But there is a number of paintings all from this series. So here's one of the early paintings. So let's just take a moment to describe his style. What are some of the characteristics you could say? And you could use it for characteristics of this painting as well. Notice how it's a very sort of stark composition. So, what I mean by that is there's not a lot of detail. Things are kind of reduced into the most basic sort of elements. It kind of has some cubist tendencies to it that way. Things are in silhouette. You don't see any facial features. There's no eyes. There's no details of ears or hair, anything like that. Um, it's very flat. It's very angular. There's patterns on fabric. It kind of has a collage like quality to it. But all of these are painted on canvas or painted on panel. So, like a piece of wood. Here's one based on the migration from the South. So, all of these people leaving the South and flooding the railways to go to these major cities to look for work. Notice how he likes to repeat colors. He repeats values like the black and the white and the gray to move your eye throughout the entire composition. So here we have 48, 49, and 50. And so you can see that he was making commentaries on the state of what it was like to live in the North. Even though um, you would think that the South would be very racist, um, and the North would be a lot better. There was still a lot of racism up north. I still think that there is a lot today. And so you can see on this panel that was 48, it's kind of the stark living conditions of people living in the North. They were poor, they didn't have a lot of money. And then we have the violence and living conditions and tenements. So, like how dangerous it was to live in some of these buildings. So, that leads us to our image in our 250. So, we're going to go ahead and watch the video. And as we watch the video, I want you to describe what the content is. So, what is this image about? How does it reflect the day in which it was painted? And what are the basic characteristics of Lawrence's style? There is two videos on Khan Academy for this. One is really long. We're going to watch the short one. I'm having you guys watch a lot of these videos in class as to save you guys some time.
We're in the Phillips Collection in Washington, D.C., and we're looking at a series of small paintings by Jacob Lawrence.
This is actually a series of paintings. There are 60 of them. Half are here in the Phillips Collection, the other half are in the Museum of Modern Art.
Actually, MoMA has the even numbers, and the Phillips has the odd numbers, and that was an arrangement that the artist agreed to because these were so sought after.
He was young when he painted these, and so it's a remarkable achievement for a very young artist.
And they document one of the most important historical events in American history, the migration of African Americans from the agricultural South into the industrial North at the end of the 19th and especially in the first half of the 20th century. So, what precipitated this was not only the extreme racism and Jim Crow laws in the South, but also a dearth of labor in the North. That is, northern industrial companies had jobs to fill.
6 million people are estimated to have moved during these waves of migrations, and Lawrence's family was one of them.
So people moved to New York, just like Lawrence's family did, but people also moved to Chicago, to St. Louis, to Pittsburgh, to all these industrial centers.
You have to imagine that life was really bad in the South for people to pick up, take all their belongings, move their families, and there must have been the hope of a much better life in the North. And I think there was in many cases, but there was also significant hardship.
And racism in the North as well.
And the great thing about this series is that Lawrence captures the complexity of what happened to people's lives when they moved.
And he does that not only by this brilliant use of color and very stark composition using tempera on hard board, but he also does it through his titling, which is almost a kind of poem that weaves its way throughout these images.
When we look at the paintings, we see geometric shapes, we see flat areas of color, and there's something spare about both the words and the images that's a big part of their power.
Well, he was really careful when he produced this. He had done a tremendous amount of research at the Schomburg Center in Harlem. This entire series really is about movement. It really is about change. The very first panel and the very last panel have to do with train stations and the movement of people. Let's take a look at this image.
Well, this is one of my favorites because one really has a palpable sense of the effects of racism and discrimination.
You have this gold barrier, you have this rope that separates the people on the right from the people on the left in this spare field, which is upended, refusing a linear perspective, giving us this exterior bird's eye view.
That gray background is entirely flattened. The figures are silhouetted in these dark colors. There's a real sense of isolation between the figures.
Well, the figures on the left, the whites, are really separate. The figure at the top left is facing away from the people on the other side of the barrier.
And he looks rather haughty to me in the way that he looks up and out.
And the man below him is clutching his newspaper, ignoring the place setting before him, and he seems to be completely lost in his own thoughts. But more than that, because of the size of his hands, he seems to be almost clutching that newspaper, defiantly refusing to acknowledge anybody else in his environment.
There's a real economy to everything here in terms of the shapes and the lines, and yet there's so much expressiveness.
And because Lawrence makes the figure on the upper right so small, we get a real sense of distance and a sense of the isolation of that figure. Look at the way that the artist leads our eye from top to bottom. Our eye falls down with a kind of increasing momentum, and he brings us, almost like a pinball machine, back and forth, zigzagging, following the line of the barrier, but also alternating between the figures on either side of that barrier.
And if we follow that barrier down all the way to the lower right, look how much we can tell about that figure from such economy of form. We can tell that this is a female figure, that she's older. Lawrence has painted her head lower than her shoulders, so she seems stooped over the table as she eats her food.
And the hat that she wears covers her so completely. Her head is almost that of a bell. It's interesting that the white figures are the only people who have their facial features depicted. The African Americans are given form and personality really by the contours of their bodies.
I feel so much more sympathy for the figures on the right, for the African American figures. Those figures on the left really do seem aloof and almost menacing.
What's fascinating is that Lawrence is bringing a visual vocabulary that is clearly well versed in modernism to a subject that in the United States really is an expression of the modern condition, of this modern migration, of industrialization, of real upheaval.
And by the vocabulary of modernism, you're referring to the flatness of the forms, the reductiveness that we see here. But we normally think about modernism as dispensing with subject matter, with narrative.
And yet here, subject matter is beautifully woven into these stark images.
Okay, so I don't think we really have to review the content of the imagery based on that video. Um, so let's just go ahead and keep going. Right? So I don't believe there's any more pieces in the 250. So if you run out of time and you want to stop listening, I can't make you keep listening. But there are some major artists in the United States outside of the Harlem Renaissance during this time before World War II. And so we also have an American muralist and realist tradition. So this is Benton, and he would often depict images um, of also the working class and different social situations. He wanted to show people as being heroic. This is the time of the Great Depression, so the WPA would hire people to make art. And so we had a lot of murals being made at this time as well to give artists jobs. So Benton would have scenes of industrialization. They often say his style is kind of like Gumby. Gumby is kind of this clay based creature from this time period, maybe even a little bit later. His figures tend to be very long and curvy. This is from a wall. So those white zigzags are part of the architecture. So scenes of nightlife in the city, industrialization, people working the fields, the rise of Nazism in Germany. We also have our regionalist or the American scene. So these are artists that are primarily from the Midwest, and they would often represent images of what it was like to live in these places. So a lot of economic depression. So once again, a lot of these artists are painting things based on the Great Depression and trying to reflect their what American identity is. how conservative and how religious people often are. So this is Edward Hopper, and Hopper does a lot of imagery um, that has kind of a common sort of theme to it. And so here is early morning, street scenes, right? You've seen this one at the Art Institute, I'm sure. This is the laundromat. This is Chop Suey, right? So a lot of his paintings have a voyeuristic sort of quality to them. So it's almost as if there's very few people, and it's kind of just like you're observing what things look like. So if I go to this one, these people don't really seem to notice us looking inside the window of this diner, right? There's a sense of social isolation here. This woman at the laundromat waiting for her laundry to get done. She's by herself, right? Chop suey, we have these two women sitting, eating, and it's like we're observing and watching their conversation. This is one of a movie theater. So, of course, normally all your attention would be on the screen, but here the screen's really, really small. And then we have this drama that's taking place on the right side. It's like, why is this woman upset? So, kind of voyeuristic looking at things that should be unseen. The next person we're going to look at is Grant Wood. And Grant Wood is representing kind of like the agricultural class of Midwest. He was from Iowa. So he grew up in a farm with a large family. Um, he often felt oppressed. He was a gay man, obviously, in a time that was not common, especially in Iowa. Um, and so he often felt rebellious and kind of out of the loop. And so a lot of people, when they look at this painting, see it as um, is this like a heroic image of a farm, right? Or is this kind of mocking? So you can watch that on Khan Academy if you're interested. I once heard an art historian talking about this painting, talk about the sense of rebellion of her. So this is supposed to be an image of a father and a daughter. So this is not a father and a wife. And she has one curl that has fallen out of her bun. And that's supposed to represent the rebellious nature, according to this art historian, of her. I just think that's really funny. She's all like prissy and prudent with her cameo and her high button collar and her apron. And then there's that one little curl that's kind of fallen out. It gets its name from that Gothic window that we see in that typical sort of farmhouse of the Midwest. The scene was actually based on an image of his sister and his dentist. So those are the two people that are depicted in the scene. They were his models. But he has just a lot of scenes that are based on agricultural lands of Iowa. This is Paul Revere, so the history of the United States, right? Here's George Washington cutting down the cherry tree. I love the surrealist quality to this one of that young, right? This is the only way we would know that it was George Washington is based on his powdered wig and so on. During this time, there's also heroic age of photography. And so Dorothea Lange is probably the most famous WPA photographer. So she would have worked for the government. She got a job. And so she was in the South um, in the Dust Bowl photographing. Actually, was she in the South? Maybe she was in California. She was photographing people. And she happened upon these migrant pea farmers. So they were harvesting peas that you would eat in canned food. And so she was depicting how hard it was for them to live. And there was a lot of social, when people saw these photos, they were really started donating money and changing some of workers' rights. When you look at it, you might think that this woman is my age or even older, but she actually was a relatively young mother, and just all that hardship of kind of working in the fields and being fearful of where the food was going to come to feed her children, really does age her. There's a great art history video on it. Um, and Dorothea Lange took many photos of her. And so you can see that this is the one that was selected by Life to produce. I'm going to end with this video. And once again, you can watch or you can not.
We often think of the art world as separate from the real world. This is rarely the case. This video is called Art and Society, a theme we will explore using 3 works. It's 1934, the height of the Great Depression. Dorothea Lange was running a successful portrait studio in Berkeley, California. The photographs she took of the social elite made her a good living. But when she looked out her window, she couldn't ignore that people were struggling.
We can't escape what's happening around us. The theme of society allows you the opportunity to think more critically about, well, where is something coming from and what's that point of view?
Lange left the studio and took her camera on the road. Hired by a New Deal program, Lange traveled up and down California. She was documenting the lives of the state's newest residents, migrant workers. Lange was driving back to San Francisco after a long assignment.
Yep,
She
California.
saw a pea pickers camp, but kept driving. 20 miles down the road, something made her turn around. I saw and approached the hungry and desperate mother, as if drawn by a magnet. The family had arrived at the camp, only to learn that the crop had been destroyed by rain. They were stranded along with 2,500 other migrants, with no work and no food. Lange took only 6 photos. She sent her negatives off to Washington, and within days, supplies were rushed to the area. The story, along with one of her photos, was printed in the San Francisco News. The picture caught the public eye. Lange's final image did more than tell the story of government aid. It connected with people. It was republished. It was displayed at the Museum of Modern Art.
Here we are decades and decades later, but we really understand or can imagine what that experience must have been like in a way that's really tangible, something that we can really relate to.